The book is called The Tyranny of the Minority. So you wrote How Democracies Die, a recipe to kill our democracy. And now Tyranny of the Minority. What is Tyranny of the Minority about?
Well, when we wrote How Democracies Die many years ago now, before it seemed so imminent to so many Americans that democracy was in danger, we wanted to write a book that described for Americans what it looks like when a democracy gets into trouble. I studied Latin America. My co-author Daniel studies Europe in the interwar period. So we've seen democracies get in trouble. We've seen democracies die. And we wanted to describe to Americans what this looked like so they would be warned. After we wrote the book, we got a lot of questions about what the hell do we do? How do we get out of this mess? And so the book is an effort, first of all, to better understand how we got into this mess, but also to think a bit about how to get out.
So when you talk about how we get into the mess, the Constitution is really our, touchstone. Is that the document that actually got us into this mess?
The Constitution, I should say, is a brilliant document. It is the world's
Don't hedge, sir.
It is the world's oldest written Constitution. It's done us a lot of good.
Yes.
But it is also part of the problem today. A majority of Americans support democracy. A majority of Americans support the really interesting experiment with multiracial democracy that we are evolving into in the 21st century. A majority of Americans every day since Donald Trump came down the golden escalator have opposed Trump. But we have a Constitution that protects, that enables, and that empowers an authoritarian minority party. And that's a problem.
But isn't that the very nature of the Constitution was the contradiction when it was being written? All men are created equal. Black people are 3/5. I mean, it's a mathematical equation that from the get-go was absurd.
It was absurd. Now, in some fairness to the founders, the elites across the world were undemocratic in the 18th century. But over the course of 200-plus years, democracies across the world have gone about fixing the original sins in their Constitution.
So you're saying that the Constitution was a balance between that ideal and the practicalities of, well, how do we let the southern states, who have less population, not be steamrolled by a pure democracy?
Right. It was a couple of things. First of all, it was a document created by people who feared democracy, who feared majority rule, because majority rule didn't exist in the world in the 18th century.
What did they think, if it wasn't kings, what did they think it was going to be?
They didn't know. They were in completely new terrain. There had never been a republic like this before. We'd never had an elected leader before. The Electoral College was a third choice. It wasn't Madison's first choice. Madison designed a system that would have looked more like Europe's parliamentary democracies.
Right.
That was shut down. A number of folks in the convention pushed for direct election of the president, which is what all other presidential democracies in the world today do. That got voted down.
Didn't they also push, not even for a unitary executive, didn't they push for the executive would be a panel, would be a group of individuals?
That was one suggestion, but so they were scrambling, right? They couldn't reach a majority, and they didn't know how to elect a president. So the Electoral College was an improvisation. It was an experiment.
Was it an improvisation to bring a compromise to the southern states? Is that because the North was more industrialized and the South and the smaller states? Okay.
Right. Look,
so this was the compromise to bring the Union together.
Yeah, I mean, this was a really tough problem, right? We had 13 colonies that were, and there was a fear that they would break apart, that there might be civil war, that there might be violence. The Articles of Confederation had failed miserably, and there was a real fear that if we didn't hang together, the Brits or the French would come in and make things very difficult for us. The whole project could be blown to bits. So these guys had to forge a compromise, and they made concessions that were imperfect. In fact, George Washington, let me just say this.
Yeah.
George Washington, just weeks after the Philadelphia Convention, wrote a letter to his nephew describing the Constitution as an imperfect document and saying that it would be up to future generations to improve upon it.
But do you think it's strange, then, that a lot of the Constitution really is a practical matter, sort of a pragmatic document that is very much nuts and bolts of how do we do this mechanically, logistically, and yet we infuse such almost religious dogma we almost view the founders now in a kind of a fundamentalist way of it was spoken through them from God. They were absolutely sure this is scripture.
Right. We didn't always see it that way. For much of U.S. history, Americans, both politicians and American citizens of all types, have worked to make our system more democratic. The expansion of suffrage, the Reconstruction reforms, the Progressive era reforms.
But oftentimes that was brought through violent upheaval. I mean, the Civil War is what brought that about. Suffragette, even the Vietnam War, when they lowered the voting age, if there hadn't have been the draft, if people hadn't have gone to Vietnam, I don't think you would have seen the expansion of voting to 18-year-olds.
Constitutional reform is tough. It's costly. It takes work. But we've done it throughout our history. And it's really only the last 50 years, only in our lifetimes, that we've kind of stopped thinking about how to make our system more democratic. We stopped doing the work of improving our democracy.
Let me ask you, and this is a slightly different point then. You know, some may be it's the design of the Constitution that allows for rural states to have maybe an outsized influence, especially in the Senate, which is a relatively minoritarian body to begin with. One person can blue slip something that people can constantly stop things as one person. And that person is always Rand Paul. No. But is there also an issue that as the world changes so rapidly, is democracy foundationally an analog system? And that in an increasingly digital and fast world, it's unwieldy even in its best iteration? And is that what also gives a kind of shine to the idea of dictatorship or authoritarian principles, where things can be mobilized more quickly, decisions can be made? You know, democracy is painstaking. It's a grind.
It is. And this is not the first time we've been around this bend, right? In a century ago, whether it was the Russian Revolution or the rise of fascism, during a period of dramatic change, industrialization, the entry into the modern era, people looked around and said, yeah, Stalin, that works better. Hitler, Mussolini, that
made the trains run on time.
Turns out, in the long run, there are costs to dictatorship, and that dictatorships they may shine for a while, but in the long run, you don't much like the results. So we always have to be, we've got old institutions, and we constantly have to be thinking about how to improve them. But the basic idea of electing our governments, and electing our governments in a context in which we enjoy a wide range of individual liberties, I don't think that's outdated.
Right. That stays no matter what the kids say on, I'm going to say, Instagram.
I think the kids get a bad rap sometimes. They are among our strongest defenders.
Well, you teach them in college, so you see them. I see them. I find them to be fascinating. You know, there's always that millennials, this or later, or whatever they're saying. I don't find that at all.
They're the ones who are going to save our emerging multiracial democracy.
They better. Somebody's got to. The Tyranny of the Minority. It's available right now. Steven Levitsky, thank you so much for being here.